You see a police car in your rearview mirror late at night and feel safe, right? But what if you're wrong? What if they aren't there to protect? What if they're hunting? Tonight's story is about a detective who learns the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the shadows. They wear a uniform. If you like horror that questions reality, leave a like. And if you're new here, subscribe, because nightmares arrive without warning. Let me know in the comments before we start. Who do you call when there's no one to call? Now turn off the lights. The night patrol has begun. My name is Frank. For the past 30 years, I have lived my life in 11-hour stretches, the limit the government allows a man to be behind the wheel before he becomes a danger to himself and others. I follow the rules. My logbook is impeccable. My truck passes every inspection. It is a lonely life, but an honest one. My father was a trucker too. He used to say that the interstates are the arteries of the nation, but the back roads, the forgotten state roads, are its veins. They are where you feel the real pulse of the country. I have always thought that driving on those roads was more interesting, a way to see the America that most people ignore. It was that thought that ruined me. I was en route from Chicago to the West Coast with a load of industrial parts. A summer storm, the kind that comes out of nowhere and seems like the end of the world, was brewing up ahead on Route 80. To get around, I consulted my paper map, an old one habit I've never lost, and saw an alternative, an old state highway that cut through a rural section of Nebraska that seemed to have been forgotten by modern cartographers. The road was rough and empty, lined with cornfields and small towns that seemed to be in a state of slow decay. The sky was a sickly purple. It was just outside one of those towns, a rusty sign calling it Havenwood, that I saw the lights blinking in my rearview mirror. A police car, old but well maintained. I sighed. I wasn't speeding. My lights were on. I pulled my Peterbilt over onto the gravel shoulder. The cop who approached my window was young, with a face that looked like it had never smiled. He didn't ask for my ID right away. He just looked at my truck, then back at me. "Your right tail light is intermittent, sir," he said, his voice flat. "Intermittent? I checked it this morning. Must be a bad connection," I replied. "State Regulation 39-22. I forget the number. Section 4. Commercial vehicles with any lighting failure must be inspected immediately at a licensed facility. I'll have to escort you to town." That actor, the one who played the Godfather, what was his name? Oh yeah, De Niro. He had that look in his eyes that said he knew everything. This young cop had the same look, but it was blank. The flashlight excuse was the weakest I'd ever heard. But I knew the number one unwritten rule of the road. You don't argue with a local cop in a town that's not yours. You smile, nod, and comply. "Sure, officer, no problem." He escorted me to Havenwood. The town was even more depressing up close. Boarded up stores peeling paint on houses, and the few people on the street looked at me with an apathy that was almost hostile. They didn't see me. They saw the police car and looked away. We went to the police station, which also served as city hall. There I met the sheriff, an older man with a prominent belly and a neat gray mustache. He offered me a coffee and explained the situation with the calm of a bureaucrat. "Frank, this is what the law says," he said after listening to his subordinate's account. "Your vehicle will be held in our yard until a full inspection is done. It could take a day or two. There's a motel down the street, good and cheap. There was no anger in his voice. There was none of the subtle greed of someone expecting a bribe. There was just a procedural calm. This was more frightening than any threat. They weren't breaking the rules. They were using the rules as a weapon, bending them until they became a cage. I was forced to leave my truck, my cargo, my life in their yard. As I walked to the motel, I had a feeling I wasn't the first trucker this had happened to. The motel was clean, but smelled of neglect. I was the only guest. I tried calling my company, but my cell phone was out of service. The room phone was dead. The TV only picked up one channel, a telemarketing program on an endless loop. Night fell, and with it, a silence I had never experienced. As someone who sleeps in noisy truck stops, I was disturbed by the utter stillness of Havenwood. Then I heard the sound, distant but clear. A low rhythmic sound like a hammer hitting wood, or maybe rocks. Knock, knock, knock. Constant, incessant. I looked out the window. The city was plunged into almost total darkness. No lights in the houses, not a soul on the street. Only the sound, which seemed to come from the direction of some wooded hills on the outskirts of the city. I stood there in the dim light of my room, thinking about my situation. I was a prisoner, not of bars, but of procedure and of forgotten geography. I remembered something I had read in college long ago before I dropped out to follow in my father's footsteps. I follow Hannah Arendt's thinking. She wrote about the banality of evil, about how the greatest horrors are not committed by monsters, but by ordinary men following orders and filling out paperwork. The sheriff and his subordinate were not monsters. They were employees. And that, somehow, was the most terrifying thing of all. The door to my room opened. The sheriff was there without even knocking. His face was calm. "Get some sleep, Frank," he said. "Tomorrow night, the work is hard." "What work? I just want my truck back." He gave me a small smile, the first I had seen from him. It was not a friendly smile. "We have a recurring community problem, a maintenance issue, and we found that a Peterbilt like yours is the perfect tool for the job. You're going to help us." I spent the next day in a haze of anxiety and helplessness. No one came to speak to me. The town remained in a state of suspended animation. The rhythmic sound had stopped with the rising of the sun. I tried to walk down the main street, but the blank stares of the few residents made me retreat to the solitude of my motel room. The food they brought me was simple but plentiful. It seemed as if they were fattening me up for slaughter. When night fell again, the sheriff and the young officer came to fetch me. The sound of crashing stones had started up again in the hills. "Where are we going?" I asked as I climbed into the patrol car. "Maintenance," the sheriff replied, his eyes never leaving the road. They led me to the yard, where my truck sat under a lone light. "Get in," the sheriff ordered, "and follow us." I drove my own truck like a prisoner being led to the gallows. We drove down a dirt road that led out of town and up toward the hills where the sound was coming from. The rhythmic pounding grew louder and louder. We stopped in front of a barbed wire fence with a sign that read, "Havenwood Quarry, private property, no trespassing." The officer opened a gate and I drove inside. The quarry was a vast scar in the earth, a deep, dark hole in the center. Around the rim of the pit, I could see figures in the shadows, the townspeople. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at the hole. And everyone held two stones, hitting them against each other in that hypnotic funereal rhythm. The sheriff pulled me over to the edge. He got out of the car and walked over to me. "Look, Frank, every place has its problems," he began, sounding like a mayor talking about a sewage problem. "Ours is this well. Things fall down it. Animals. Sometimes people. People get lost. The problem is the well, it gets hungry. And when it gets hungry, bad things happen to the town. Disease, accidents. The well has to be fed. It's an old tradition, a sacrifice, if you will, to keep the balance." I looked at his face, searching for a sign of madness. There was none. He was talking about this as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked hoarsely. "We used to use our own cars, but it's a waste. We've found that the weight of a truck like yours is much more efficient at pushing things around." He jerked his chin. Near the edge of the well was a rusty old car, a sedan from the 1990s. It had out-of-state license plates. "That one belonged to a salesman who came through here last year. He had engine trouble." My blood ran cold in my veins. I understood. Their corruption wasn't about money. They were the priests of a sick ritual. They used the law to capture outsiders and their vehicles to feed whatever lived or didn't live in that hole. I wouldn't be the offering. I would be the tool. "You want me to push that car into the hole?" I stammered. "Exactly," the sheriff said. "Do that. And tomorrow morning, you'll be free to go. With your flashlight fixed, of course." The young officer was standing beside me now, his hand on his holster. The crowd continued to bang rocks, a silent jury. I had no choice. I climbed back into the cab of my truck, my hand shaking so badly I could barely start it. I put it in reverse, lined up my bumper with the rusted cars. I closed my eyes and accelerated. There was a groan of protesting metal, and then the car began to move. It slid to the edge and hung there for a moment before plummeting into darkness. The instant the car disappeared into the pit, absolute silence fell over the quarry. The villagers stopped pounding stones together, and from the pit there came no sound of impact. There came an even deeper silence, an absence of sound that seemed to suck the air from my lungs. The pit had been fed. The next morning, as promised, my truck was released. The taillight was working perfectly. The sheriff shook my hand and wished me a safe journey. No one mentioned the night before. I drove out of Havenwood without looking back. I've been on the road for 3 days. I haven't stopped to sleep. I know I'm safe, that they've let me go. But that's not the point. The point is what I've become. I've been complicit in a ritual of discarding, a cog in the machine of that town. Hannah Arendt was right about the banality of evil, but she forgot to mention how contagious it is. And now, as I drive through the arteries of America, I wonder, how many Havenwoods are there out there, hidden in the folds of maps off the main highways? How many sheriffs keep the peace by feeding a well? And the question that keeps me awake at night, that keeps me speeding in the dark: what happens when the well gets hungry again? I'd always thought the smell of a patrol car was a strange mix of stale coffee, cheap disinfectant, and the faint metallic tang of fear. It had been the scent of my office for the past 5 years. To my partner, Jack Dempsey, it had been the smell of home. Jack was the kind of cop who seemed to have been born with the badge. 20 years on the job and a calmness that bordered on the uncanny. He had a theory for everything. "Look, Miller," he'd say, in that Queen's accent that never left him, "most of our job isn't catching bad guys. It's being a barrier of boredom between the chaos and the people who pay our salaries." The night he died, chaos broke loose. We got a call about a robbery in progress at a warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore. Nothing out of the ordinary. But when we arrived, the scene was wrong. Too quiet. The warehouse door was broken in, but there was no sign of a struggle. Jack, with his experience, should have noticed. Maybe he did. He told me to wait in the car while he looked around. That was the last order he gave me. I heard a single gunshot. When I went inside, he was down, his chest stained red in stark contrast to the gray cement floor. There was no one else there. Just the echo of the gunshot and the smell of fresh gunpowder mixed with the stale air. The official version was that he surprised the robbers and got the worst of it. Simple, clean, but not for me. Jack was no slouch. And there was something in Sergeant Evans's eyes when he broke the news to me, a kind of practiced pity that sent a chill down my spine. Evans was a man who measured words like gold. That night, he had been too generous with his comfort. I started digging, quietly, of course. I asked for access to Jack's case files under the guise of wanting to understand what went wrong. Evans was reluctant, but he relented. What I was looking for was not a clue about anonymous thieves. I was looking for a pattern. And I found one. Over the past 6 months, a series of large-scale drug and cash busts, all led by Jack, had resulted in accounting errors. Evidence that disappeared from the evidence locker, reports that were corrected by a clerk who, coincidentally, had requested a transfer to another state a week after Jack's death. I remembered a conversation I'd had with Jack a few weeks earlier. We'd been at a bar after a long shift. He'd sounded worried, which was unusual. He'd mentioned a ledger book, not an official one, but a personal one, where he'd written down things that didn't add up. "You know, Miller," he'd said, swirling the ice in his glass, "sometimes the monsters aren't on the streets. They're wearing the same uniforms we do." At the time, I'd thought it was the whiskey talking. Now his words echoed in my ears like a fire alarm. Where was that ledger? Jack's widow, a devastated woman who could barely look me in the eye, said she didn't know anything. But her fear was palpable. It was the same fear I saw on the faces of victims every day. But this wasn't the victim of a random crime. She was the widow of a cop. Her fear was different. It was deeper, more informed. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and sleeplessness. Every car that drove slowly down my street, every glance that lingered a little too long in the cafeteria at the police station, all felt like a threat. I was turning into the kind of person I used to arrest, a haunted man looking over his shoulder at every turn. I started having memory lapses, forgetting the names of colleagues I'd worked with for years. One of them reminded me of that actor. What's his name? The one who did that movie about the boxer. Oh yeah, Stallone. The mind plays tricks on you when it's under pressure. Mine was falling apart. I decided to visit Jack's widow again. This time, I was more direct. "Mary," I said, sitting in her living room, which still felt like a shrine to a dead man, "I know Jack was investigating something big. He mentioned a book. She broke down. The tears she had been holding back came out in a flood of pain and relief. He called it the Book of Whispers, she said between sobs. He said it was his life insurance. He kept it, oh my God, he kept it in the one place no one would think to look. The place was a secret compartment in Jack's old fishing boat, docked in a rundown marina an hour outside the city. It was brilliant. Corrupt cops don't mess with old rusty boats. They like shiny new things. I found a book. It was a plain black notebook, but the contents were dynamite. Names, dates, amounts, names of cops, prosecutors, even a judge, all connected to a racket of extortion and embezzlement. Sergeant Evans's name was in it, over and over again. I knew taking this to the Internal Affairs Department was a risk. Who knew how far the rot would go? That's when I remembered a quote from Albert Camus that I'd read in college. I follow Albert Camus's line. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. I didn't want to be a martyr. I wanted justice. But in the world I lived in, the two concepts seemed dangerously close. I decided to seek out a detective from Internal Affairs, Isabella Rossi. She had a reputation for being ruthless, a lone wolf who trusted no one. She was exactly who I needed. I arranged to meet at an anonymous cafe, away from the eyes of our jurisdiction. I showed her the book. She leafed through it, her expression impassive, but I saw a gleam in her eyes. It wasn't surprise, it was confirmation. You know what happens now, don't you, Miller? She said, closing the notebook. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. There's no going back. They know you're digging. Dempsey's death was a warning. The next one won't be a warning. Rossi was right. The pressure mounted. I was placed on desk duty, a thinly veiled humiliation. My transfer requests were lost. Evans called me into his office. The fatherly comfort was gone, replaced by a cold, cutting threat. "You're chasing ghosts, Miller," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "Sometimes, out of respect for the memory of a good cop, it's best to leave the ghosts alone." But they weren't ghosts. They were real men, and they were scared. Rossi and I worked in secret, piecing together the case. Every page of Jack's book was a piece of the puzzle, and we corroborated it with bank statements, phone records, and confidential statements from informants Rossi had cultivated over the years. It was a rotten house of cards, and we were about to blow it down. The night it all came to a head was a storm, literally. Torrential rain lashed the city, as if the sky itself wanted to wash away the mess. Rossi got the warrants. The operation was silent, surgical. We caught Evans at home, in his pajamas. His arrogance melted away, replaced by mute shock. Others followed. The net was bigger than we had imagined. It involved almost a third of our district. Jack's book, the Book of Whispers, became the centerpiece of the indictment. His handwriting, so familiar to me, sealed the fate of men he had once called brothers. I had avenged my partner, but there was no taste of victory, only the bitter taste of ash in my mouth. A few weeks later, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a digital recorder. I pressed play. The voice was Jack's, muffled, as if he were talking on the phone. "No, I'm not backing down. This has to stop. I have everything. The book. Miller doesn't know anything. I kept him out of it. He's a good kid. He still believes." The recording cut out. I stood there in my quiet room, tape recorder in hand. He wasn't ordering me to stay behind that night. He was trying to protect me, and I, in my blind pursuit of justice, had walked headfirst into the lion's den he had tried to spare me. I'm still a cop, but something inside me snapped. The wall of boredom Jack spoke of crumbled, and I saw the chaos on the other side, and the chaos had a familiar face. It had a badge. Is corruption a flaw in the system, or is the system working as designed, only for the benefit of a few? How many other whisper books are out there, stored in old boats and dusty basements, waiting for someone to have the courage or the foolishness to open them? I don't have the answers. I only have the echo of Jack's voice in my head and the lingering smell of stale coffee and fear in my patrol car. I've always felt that silence has weight, not the peaceful silence of an empty house, but the heavy, dense silence that settles after violence. As a former Marine, I'd known that silence in remote deserts. As a homicide detective in Detroit's Special Crimes Division, I'd encountered it in forgotten alleys and apartments stained by unspeakable acts. Over the past few months, that silence had become my constant companion. It all started with the case we nicknamed the Collector. Bodies were turning up in abandoned places around town, each with the same precise injury. Missing eyes, removed with a surgical skill that made even the most seasoned coroners shudder. There was no sign of a struggle, no forensic evidence. The victims, seemingly random, were people on the fringes of society: vagabonds, drug addicts, prostitutes, people who would not be missed. To most at the police station, they were just another pile of paperwork, a nuisance to be filed away and forgotten. But something about the symmetry of the crimes, their ritualistic audacity, consumed me. My partner, Alistair, a veteran on the verge of retirement, advised me to let it go. "Miles," he said, in the weary voice of someone who's seen it all, "you can't save them all, especially the ones who don't want to be saved." He had a habit of snapping his fingers when he was nervous, a sharp sound like a twig snapping. Lately, he hadn't stopped snapping his fingers. My obsession with the case isolated me. I began working late, going through the files, searching for a connection that had eluded me. It was on one of those nights, with the station in the artificial stillness of 3 a.m, that I noticed something, a pattern in the patrol schedules. On each night of the murder, the same patrol car manned by officers Calloway and Thorne would log a routine call just a few blocks from the crime scene, minutes before the estimated time of death. 1, coincidence. 2, a pattern. 3, an invitation to dig deeper. I began to follow them discreetly. Calloway and Thorne were the kind of cops who moved with predatory confidence, the kind who made good citizens cross the street. One cold, damp night, I watched them approach a homeless man in an alley. It wasn't a standard approach. It was quiet, efficient. One of them, I think it was Thorne. No, Calloway. He had an uncanny ability to move without making a sound, like a ghost in uniform. They didn't arrest him. They put him in the squad car and drove off, lights off. The report that night would list a disturbance of the peace that was resolved with a verbal warning. The homeless man was never seen again. Fear began to creep into my bones, a chill that no coat could warm. I was dealing with something darker than a simple police brutality. There was a methodology, a purpose. I remembered a quote I'd read by a writer whose name escapes me now, a Romanian guy, I think. Something about the nature of evil. Oh yes, Emil Cioran. I follow Emil Cioran's line. Man started from the bottom. He invented fire, the wheel, the state, poetry, and boredom. To combat boredom, he invented crime. But this wasn't about boredom. It was about something else, a hunger. I shared my suspicions with Alistair. I showed him the patrol logs, the photos of the last missing person. He listened silently, his face a mask of concern. He snapped his fingers, once, twice, 3 times. "Miles, this is dangerous," he said, his voice low. "You're accusing 2 of our own. You need hard evidence or they'll destroy you." He promised to help, said he'd check a few things out on his own. That was the last time I saw him alive. 2 days later, his car was found at the bottom of a river. The official report was suicide. Alistair, the man who counted the days until he could fish in peace at his lake house, had apparently filled his pockets with rocks and jumped into the icy water. No one at the station seemed to question it. The morning was replaced by a knowing silence, the same heavy silence I knew so well. Now, he was within the walls of the place I called my second home. The captain arranged the papers on my desk, an almost fatherly act, and gave me a week's leave. "To process," he said. I knew it was a warning. I used the week to break into Alistair's flat. He was a methodical man. If he found something, he would have written it down. I found, hidden deep in a box of old jazz records, a small diary. The last pages were a series of feverish notes. Names, Calloway, Thorne, and others, even the captain's. And one word, repeated over and over: harvest. There was also the address of an abandoned warehouse near the shipyards. That night, I went there. The place stank of mold and decay. In the center of the main floor, the concrete was stained with a dark, intricate pattern like a sigil from a book of nightmares. And amid the sigil, a small metal object. It was a bird whistle, the same kind Alistair always carried, a memento from his father. But this one was different. It was cold, unnaturally cold to the touch, and when I picked it up, I felt an overwhelming dizziness, a sensation of falling into a dark abyss. I heard a sound behind me. Calloway and Thorne were standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light of the street. They didn't draw the weapons, they just smiled. And in the silence of that warehouse, their smiles were the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "He was curious, like you," Calloway said, his voice calm, almost didactic. "Curiosity is a hunger, and all hungers must be fed." They didn't attack me, they just watched me with those blank, patient eyes of predators who know their prey has nowhere to go. The whistle in my hand seemed to pulse with cold energy. The sigil on the floor. I realized it wasn't paint. It was blood. Old blood, seeping into the concrete. The horror of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't corrupt cops killing for profit or power. This was a cult. They were feeding something, and the victims, the homeless, the addicts, they were the offering, the harvest. I ran like I had never run in my life, driven by pure primal terror. They didn't follow me. They didn't need to. The fear they instilled in me was a more effective leash than any handcuffs. I took Alistair's diary and the whistle to the only person I thought might be able to help me. A contact of mine at the FBI, a man named Jensen. I handed them to him, my voice shaking as I told the story. He listened, unmoved. He promised to look into it. 2 days later, the news came. Jensen had suffered a massive stroke at his desk. He was 45 years old and in perfect health. The diary and a whistle had disappeared from the FBI evidence locker. Now, silence is my only companion. I have moved to a small town with a name I can barely pronounce. I work a menial, anonymous job, but I know they have not forgotten me. Sometimes at night, I hear the faint sound of a bird's whistle in the wind, and I see faces in the crowd, men with empty eyes and patient smiles. They are not just police officers. They are priests of an ancient and terrible faith, hidden under the protection of a badge. They serve not the law, but a hunger that creeps in the shadows of our civilization. And the city, the world, keeps turning, ignorant of the parasite that feeds on its entrails. Is evil merely a perversion of order, or is it an order in itself with its own rules and rituals? What if the institutions we create to protect ourselves are actually the temples where the worst in us can flourish unseen? I don't know. I only know that sometimes, when the silence deepens, I hold my breath and wonder if tonight the harvest will come for me. As my grandfather used to say, there are doors that once opened can never be closed again. I have opened that door, and now all I can do is wait in the dark.